Hi, my name is Frank Zwaan. Welcome to my talk, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this first seminar of the new year. So Happy New Year to all of you. And I would like to present you some analog modeling work that we did in a collaboration between the University of Bern and people from the University of Strasbourg. So Bern in Switzerland and Strasbourg in France. And the topic here is complex rift systems or rift patterns, and whether they can be a result of interacting crustal and mantle weaknesses, or if multiphase rifting has an important influence as well. And what you can see here in this first figure is already a bit of a snapshot of the main results. And you will later see this as well, is that we have, these are top views of models where we have these yellow, red images showing where faults are active, and the greenish images are showing where topography is being developed, where basins are forming. And as you can see, we have very complex, or relatively complex at least, structures. And if you look from the left to the right, you can see that there are changes in the patterns in the red, which means that different faults are active at different times. And this has to do with different orientations of inheritance and with the velocity of our extension, which is slow, for instance, or fast. This said, I would like to dive into this presentation. And the first motivation of why we were interested in this whole thing. So if we look, for instance, at East Africa, we know that we have the East African rift system, and we have some beautiful structures that we've seen in the previous talks. But on a larger scale, if we look at the different, the axis of the rifts, they are following certain, certain patterns that are similar to the weaknesses in the lithosphere. And if you then look at the lithosphere, or if you take the lithosphere as a very simple rheological profile, like in this figure here, then we have two important layers that are stronger, which is the upper brittle crust and the high strength mantle, or the upper brittle mantle. And in between, we have the lower ductile crust, which is weak, and below we have the low strength mantle. And then there can be, if you have weaknesses in these layers, they are likely to reactivate and dominate the system. The question is then, are there any interactions between these two types of weaknesses, either in the upper crust or in the mantle? And how does this work in 3D? So there's a little sketch here of what something like weaknesses or inheritance might look, what it might look like. It could be perhaps very complex. And then the second motivation is that if we look at previous work from, for instance, Sascha Brune, there are changes in velocity over time during rifting. For instance, this is the breakup of the South Atlantic. And if we trace the velocity of rifting, we start relatively slow, and then at some point there's a speed up. This is before actual breakup, before the ocean really develops. And then we continue at high speeds. So we have changes in kinematics. And then the question is, how do these complex structural inheritances, these weaknesses, and these kinematic factors interact to develop complex rift systems? So the method that we applied is analog modeling. And the aim of this kind of modeling is to reproduce tectonic processes in the laboratory. This is because if we look at nature, for instance, this is a nice picture from the Andes in Patagonia. We have these beautiful structures, these beautiful folds, but they are very large. They formed over millions of years, so it's very difficult to really understand how they form. And therefore, we go to the laboratory and we make small-scale models in which we can, with simple materials, in which we can understand these large-scale structures on a small scale. And well, you can run them in a couple of hours, perhaps. And then you have an idea of the dynamics involved in this kind of system. So that's the whole reason for the analog modeling, and we applied this for our study. So this is a very simple sketch of our very simple setup, if you want. We start with the strength profile to the left, where we have the strong mantle, which is represented by a base plate here, and especially the edge of this base plate. And on top of that, we have our lower crust and our upper crustal layers. So this base plate here is moved away. It's fixed to this sidewall here, and then it's moved away. And then the viscous layer representing the lower crust, and the sand layer on top, which is reacting brittly, creating brittle structures, like you can see here, it's a little rift. This is this is then deforming. So this VD is a mantle fracture or a mantle weakness, and we have these crustal layers on top. And the other thing that we have is a weakness in the upper crust, which is represented by a so-called C. This is a little bar of viscous material, and this makes that the sand layer or the upper crust is locally weaker, and therefore it will localize deformation. This is basically how we do this, and then we build our model. This is just a little bit of a snapshot of how we, or a little series of figures that shows how we.
Hi, Frank.
Model. Yeah.
You've used 10 minutes now. Just on the list.
Okay. That's already very fast. Sorry. So this is then showing the VD or the mantle structure, and here we have these seeds showing the crustal structure. On top of that, we put our sand layer, and then we move our sidewall apart. We have our VD being moved apart, and we get beautiful structures, as you can see here, which have different orientations of structures of our rifts. These are two little videos. To the left, I show you again this picture, which this analysis, which shows you where faults are active. So you can see how different faults are active over time, and we get these complex structures where we have different orientations of crustal and mantle weaknesses, and also the topography is showing a similar thing here. So this is also very nice, so you can really see the evolution of this kind of thing. And then if we make a little bit of an overview of what we can do, where we have different orientations of structures. So here we have the mantle structure, which is horizontal, or which is slightly oblique. You get very different structures. And then if we apply our crustal weaknesses over here, you can see that we get even more complex orientations of structures, and we can change that in different orientations and get even more complex things. Now, if we have this result here, and we have these two orientations of structures, one can think, if you would not know about this model, how it works or how it's developed, that we have two orientations and therefore two rift phases, like shown here to the left, where one of the second one is overlapping the first one. But it doesn't have to be the case if you have this kind of single phase extension with differently oriented crustal and mantle weaknesses. So that's the first step, or the first result. And the second point is that we have this velocity change. And what is shown here to the left is the first phase of extension in a simple model, which only has a mantle structure, in which we start with slow rifting, and you can see you get these beautiful double rift system. And then if you start to rift faster, then the deformation, which is a bit more widespread here, starts to be localized in the center. And this is the same for other models where we have seeds, which are either parallel to this mantle structure or oblique. And what you can see here nicely, especially in this one to the left, is that we first have these crustal weaknesses being, or the crustal structures being more active. And then suddenly, if we start to move way faster, then the mantle becomes very important. So it's kind of overprinting the structure. We did the opposite as well. And this is the snapshot that I showed you at the start. And this is the model where we start with this slow rifting, where first the crustal structures are dominating the system. And then you have a shift if you start to move very fast to the mantle structure kind of breaking through and overprinting the whole system. And if we do the opposite, where we start with fast rifting, so let's say that might happen, then you start with your localized structure. And then if you move to slow rifting, you get your crustal structures being dominant. And interestingly, you get very similar structures at the end of either of these sequences. So it can be really very complex. So again, we have these interactions between these crustal and mantle weaknesses, and then also the impact of the velocity of our rifting. And this is a really nice incentive to revisit some natural examples. For instance, the North Sea, where we seem to have maybe two phases of rifting, but perhaps it might just be that where we have two different orientations of rifting, perhaps shown by these red arrows. But it might just be that we have a change in velocity, which then might reactivate different types of weaknesses in different parts of the lithosphere. If you would like to know more, you can of course ask me a question now, or later on send me an email, and especially you can also check our papers in Solid Earth and Basin Research. Thank you very much for your attention, and question time, I guess.
Awesome, thank you, Frank. And we have time for questions for Frank and also for the other presenters, but we should start with Frank first, give him the first few minutes for questions. So does anyone have questions for Frank? I can go first. So Frank, I have a few questions, but I'll start with one. So do you have, is your rig built to allow cross-sectional view of those structures? I'm pretty interested in how those multiphase faulting interact at depth. Do you have any possible way of doing that?
Yes, we do. So thank you very much for your question. We do have two ways of doing this. The first one would be to make physical cross sections at the end of the model. So what you can do is you can wet the sand, and then it kind of stabilizes like a sandcastle, and you can just cut it and you can see what's going on the inside. This is the traditional way of doing this. I also did this actually for these models. It doesn't, however, it doesn't really give you that much interesting information, to be very honest, inside of the model. And the other option is CT scanning, which we can also do in Burn. This whole machine can be put in a CT scanner, and we apply this for the first paper. Where you can live, if you want, you can make these scans of the model while it's running, so you can see how it evolves over time, and then you can use that to look at how they really interact in depth. But what basically happens is that if you so we actually didn't do it for the multiphase rifting, but what you probably can predict is that you overprint, that they kind of break through the previous structures, as you kind of see on the topography.
And then I'm also wondering at what depths each of the fault sets detach. Like in the first phase, did you detach at the MOHO or at the LAB, and then in the second phase?
So what would happen is, in the models at least, if you have your velocity discontinuity, your plate below the model, and you have your viscous layers on top, your sand layer on top of that. If you only have the crustal weaknesses, the seeds activating, then the deformation will localize at these seeds, so at the base of your brittle crust. If you have the mantle being dominant, if you have higher extension velocity or perhaps a thinner viscous layer, that's another option. Then what will happen is that, and that's why we have these double rifts actually at the topography, that there is some kind of a shear zone moving away from the velocity discontinuity through the viscous layer, and then it hits away from the VD, it hits the sand layer, and then you get two separate grabens that nucleate where this deformation is transferred into the brittle layer. I hope that makes sense. We try to draw.
Right, thank you. No problem. So there's a question coming in the chat.
I think it's Sasha.
Yeah, it's Sasha. Sasha, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd have a question on the implementation of the weaknesses and how realistic they are compared to the complexities that we see in nature. So could you elaborate a bit on how much more you would expect in nature to happen, and what processes you actually can cover with the analog models that you're running?
There's plenty of complexities that you can implement if you really want to. So, for instance, one thing that we didn't do is sedimentation, but another thing is stuff like magnetism or thermal effects. However, the argumentation is here that we start with the early rifting, and therefore these processes probably are not that important. That's the assumption that we make. Other things that we can do, I mean, if we think about these seeds, these ways of deforming, there are other ways of doing that. You can, for instance, pre-cut the sand. That's something we did. I didn't show it in the presentation, but it's something we did in the first study, and that would be a fault plane basically in the sand that's pre-existing from a previous tectonic event some long time ago, and this fault is less weak, so it's a stronger weakness, if you want, compared to the seeds. And you can also change the size of your seed. There are different ways of changing this, let's say the weakness type. And perhaps you could also change the basal boundary condition. Now we have this base plate, which represents So a fracture really, or the edge of this plate is a fracture in the upper mantle. You could also maybe have a system in which you have a more ductile or distributed deformation at the base. And if you are in a system where you have a lot of magmatism, like maybe East Africa, yeah, you might want to inject something like a fluid or so to represent maybe the magma assisted faulting or rifting. So this is there are some constraints, some assumptions that we make for these models, but we have very clear results at the same time. So we understand what the different parameters, what they do in the model, what differences they cause, and that's also a good thing. So we keep it relatively simple so that we can actually understand what's going on. But it would be very nice to link this, for instance, to numerical models and to maybe add a couple more parameters to maybe go to a larger scale as well.
Okay, thanks.
And there's a question from Ling. Ling, can you unmute and ask your question? If not, I can go ahead and read it. All right, I'm just gonna go ahead. So the person is asking, thanks for the nice talk. What if there are more than one layer of weakness?
So actually we do have more layers of weakness. So we have the upper crust and we have the mantle, but I assume that you mean that you could also have maybe different layers within the crust or within the mantle. I wouldn't know. I guess they would also interact depending on how strong they are or how weak they are, and what also their orientation is. That's another important part. The orientation is quite important. If the orientation is not good, they will not reactivate, at least in our models. So it probably would be even more complex than it already is in our models.